The autumn of 1891 brought more than just golden leaves to the valleys of Pennsylvania. For Hannah Willowbrook, it carried a promise written on paper and sealed with wax, a promise of love from a stranger 2,000 miles away. But what happens when promises break under the weight of expectations? When a woman journeys across the country only to discover that her appearance matters more than her heart? This is the story of Hannah, who was told she was too much, and the unexpected soul who finally showed her she was exactly enough. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the textile mill town of Lowell, Massachusetts, where brick buildings stretched toward the sky and the constant hum of machinery provided the heartbeat of the community, Hannah Willowbrook stood out not just for her height, but for the way her laugh could fill a room. Hannah was 32, an age when most women had long settled into marriage with children clinging to their skirts. But life had taken her down a different path. After her father's passing left her mother bedridden with grief, Hannah had spent her youth caring for her, watching as friends married and moved away, postponing her own dreams until they faded like old fabric left too long in the sun. When her mother finally passed, Hannah found herself alone in a small apartment above Donovan's bakery, with nothing but her exceptional skill with a needle and thread to sustain her. She worked as a seamstress, creating wedding gowns for brides who were often a decade younger, her fingers crafting delicate lace patterns while her own heart remained untouched by romance. "You've got hands that create magic," Mrs. Donovan would say, watching Hannah work late into the evening. "But what about your own happiness, dear? A woman needs more than a needle and thread to warm her bed at night." Hannah would smile, her round cheeks dimpling, though the light rarely reached her eyes. "Some of us aren't meant for traditional happiness," she'd reply, stretching the truth like she stretched fabric, just enough to make it fit. The truth was, Hannah had watched how men's eyes skipped over her in favor of more delicate, slender women. At 5'9", with what her mother had diplomatically called a sturdy build, Hannah had learned early that her body didn't fit the mold of desirability that men in Lowell seemed to favor. She'd made peace with it, or so she told herself, as she stitched dreams into other women's gowns, until the newspaper advertisement changed everything. It happened on a Tuesday, rain tapping against the window pane as Hannah sat in Jensen's tea room during her rare afternoon off. She was leafing through the Boston Herald, sipping chamomile, when the small print caught her eye. "Seeking bride. Successful cattle rancher in Montana Territory seeks honest, hard-working woman of good character for marriage. Age 25-35 preferred. Must enjoy rural life and desire children. Appearance secondary to kind heart and capable hands. Contact Jackson Montgomery, Box 117, Silver Creek, Montana Territory." Hannah read it 3 times, her tea growing cold. Appearance secondary to a kind heart. Those words lodged in her chest like a seed finding soil after a long drought. That night, she penned a letter by lamplight, her normally steady hand trembling slightly as she described herself honestly. Her work as a seamstress, her years caring for her mother, her love of books and ability to cook hearty meals. She mentioned her height and build in passing, focusing instead on her longing for family and wide-open spaces after years confined to city walls. When she sealed the envelope, something fluttered in her chest. Not quite hope, but it's cautious. Cousin Jackson Montgomery's reply came 6 weeks later, his handwriting bold and slanted across the page. He described his ranch, 500 acres, with a creek running through it, a 2-story house he'd built with his own hands, a small herd of cattle that was growing each year. He wrote of spectacular sunsets and air so clean it made your lungs feel new. Most importantly, he wrote that her letter had touched him with its honesty and gentle humor. I believe two people committed to building a life together can overcome any obstacle, he wrote. If you would consider becoming my wife, I would treat you with respect and provide a good home. In time, perhaps affection would grow into something deeper. 3 letters later, Hannah found herself standing before Mr. Jensen, the banker who had handled her mother's meager affairs. "You're certain about this, Miss Willowbrook?" he asked, eyebrows raised as he counted out the money from her account. "Traveling all that way to marry a man you've never met?" Hannah straightened her spine. "Mr. Montgomery seems honorable in his letters, and what waits for me here except more wedding gowns for other women?" That evening, she sat on her narrow bed, surrounded by the pieces of her life that could fit into one trunk. Her mother's silver hairbrush, a small stack of novels, her sewing kit, carefully wrapped daguerreotypes of her parents, and clothing she'd reinforced with extra stitching for the journey. Everything else, her mother's china, the rocking chair, her collection of thimbles, she sold to Mrs. Fitzgerald down the hall. As Hannah folded her winter shawl, her fingers traced the embroidery along its edge. Violets and forget-me-nots she'd stitched during her mother's final winter. This she couldn't part with. The day of departure arrived with a sky the color of slate. Hannah wore her best dress, navy blue wool with a lace collar she'd added herself, and a hat she'd trimmed with a single pheasant feather. Mrs. Donovan pressed a small parcel of fresh bread and cheese into her hands. "For the train," she said, embracing Hannah with flowery arms. "Write to us when you arrive." The train station buzzed with activity as Hannah surrendered her trunk to a porter. Standing on the platform, she felt strangely light, as though she'd left pieces of herself scattered throughout Lowell, a thread of resignation here, a scrap of loneliness there. As the train belched steam and the conductor called for boarding, Hannah took one last look at the only town she'd ever known. Then she straightened her shoulders and stepped into the carriage, her heart drumming a rhythm of terror and exhilaration. The journey west transformed Hannah in ways she hadn't anticipated. Each mile that carried her away from Massachusetts seemed to peel away years of quiet resignation. She watched landscapes transform outside her window, hills giving way to vast plains, forests thinning into prairies that stretched toward horizons she'd only imagined. At night, as the train rocked her toward Montana, Hannah would reread Jackson's letters in the dim light of the carriage, tracing his words with her fingertip. Appearance secondary to a kind heart. Perhaps in this wild country, where people were judged by their resilience rather than their silhouette, she might finally find belonging. On the 7th day, as mountains rose in the distance like sentinels, guarding the territory, Hannah pressed her fingertips to the glass. Tomorrow, she will meet the man who might become her husband. Tomorrow, her new life will begin. She slept that night with dreams full of wide skies and the face of a man she'd created from ink and paper, a face that smiled when it saw her, truly saw her, for the first time. Silver Creek, Montana Territory, emerged from the mist like a painting half-finished, raw, untamed, with buildings scattered like wooden blocks against a backdrop of mountains that pierced the clouds. As the stagecoach rumbled down the final stretch of road, Hannah pressed her handkerchief to her lips, stomach churning with each jolt and bounce. "First time out west?" asked the elderly woman seated across from her, eyes kind beneath a weathered bonnet. Hannah nodded, unable to find her voice, as the reality of what she'd done crashed over her. She'd traveled nearly 2,000 miles to marry a stranger. She'd left behind everything familiar, the rhythmic clatter of the textile mills, the comforting smell of fresh bread from Donovan's bakery, the predictable patterns of her small life. "You'll get used to the wilderness," the woman continued, misreading Hannah's silence as fear of the landscape. "The winters are harsh, but there's a beauty here you won't find anywhere else." The stagecoach lurched to a stop outside the Silver Creek General Mercantile. Hannah gathered her reticule and the small carpet bag containing essentials for her first night, Her trunk would follow on the next freight wagon. The driver helped her down, her boots landing in Montana dirt for the first time. Jackson Montgomery's ranch is about 8 miles north, the driver informed her, pointing toward a distant ridge. There's usually someone from his place in town on Thursdays for supplies. Today was Tuesday. Hannah's heart fluttered like a trapped bird. She hadn't considered this gap in their plans, the final stretch between Silver Creek and the ranch. Her letter announcing her arrival date had been sent weeks ago, but there was no way to know if it had reached Jackson. "Is there somewhere I might wait?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "A hotel or boarding house?" "The Silver Dollar has rooms," the driver replied, already loading new cargo. "Bit rough around the edges, but the widow Carson who runs it keeps it clean." With no other options, Hannah made her way down Silver Creek's main street, really just a wide dirt road lined with false-fronted buildings. Men in dusty clothes paused their conversations to watch her pass, their gazes lingering longer than propriety allowed. She felt conspicuous in her Eastern traveling dress, the fabric too heavy, the style too formal for this frontier town. The Silver Dollar Hotel was a 2-story building with peeling paint and a creaking porch. Inside, widow Carson, a sharp-eyed woman with steel-gray hair pulled into a severe bun, looked Hannah up and down with undisguised curiosity. "Mail-order bride?" she asked bluntly. Hannah flushed. "I'm to marry Mr. Jackson Montgomery." Something flickered across the widow's face. "Montgomery, you say, from up at Elk Ridge Ranch?" "Yes. Do you know him?" The widow's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "Everyone knows everyone in these parts, miss. Rooms 50 cents a night include supper and breakfast." That evening, seated at the long dining table with 3 traveling salesmen and a young doctor newly arrived to serve the growing community, Hannah felt the first real pangs of doubt. What if Jackson Montgomery found her lacking? What if the connection they'd built through letters crumbled when faced with reality? She picked at her stew, appetite diminished by anxiety, and excused herself early. In her small room, she unpacked her nightgown and the letters she'd carried close to her heart throughout the journey. Rereading them now, she searched for reassurance. In his words, in the plans they'd discussed for the ranch, for children, for a life built together from nothing but mutual respect and shared purpose. Sleep came fitfully, dreams fractured by images of a faceless man turning away from her. Wednesday dawned bright and cold. Hannah woke to frost patterns on her window and the smell of coffee wafting up from below. She dressed with particular care in a forest green, dress that complemented her hazel eyes, pinning her thick chestnut hair into a style that softened her strong features. From her carpet bag, she withdrew a small pot of rose-scented cream, smoothing it onto her wind-chapped hands and face. These small rituals of femininity, once performed mechanically, now carried the weight of hope and fear. She wanted to look her best when Jackson first saw her, and wanted his expression to be one of pleasant surprise rather than disappointment. After breakfast, Hannah ventured out to explore Silver Creek while waiting for news of transport to the ranch. The town consisted of little more than essential businesses: the mercantile, a smithy, a small bank, 2 saloons, a 1-room schoolhouse, and a church still under construction. At the mercantile, she purchased a warmer shawl, more suited to Montana's autumn chill, listening as the shopkeeper's wife chatted about local affairs. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Are you staying long in Silver Creek?" the woman asked, measuring out fabric for another customer. "No, I'm to marry Mr. Montgomery from Elk Ridge Ranch," Hannah replied, immediately regretting her candor when conversation around her momentarily hushed. "Are you now?" The shopkeeper's wife exchanged glances with her husband. "Well, isn't that something?" By midday, Hannah sensed that news of her arrival and purpose had spread through the small community. Wherever she walked, she felt eyes. Following her, heard whispers just beyond earshot. The scrutiny made her increasingly self-conscious, aware of how her sturdy frame and height set her apart from the few women she'd seen in town. On Thursday morning, Hannah rose before dawn, too anxious to sleep. Today, surely, someone from the ranch would come to town. Today, her waiting would end. She dressed in her second-best dress, a deep blue wool with subtle embroidery at the collar and cuffs, her fingers trembling slightly as she fastened each button. In the small mirror above her washstand, she studied her reflection, the high forehead, the full cheeks that dimpled when she smiled, the strong chin that spoke of determination rather than delicacy. Not beautiful, perhaps, but pleasant enough. Honest. The sound of wagons and horses drew her to the window. Thursday was evidently market day in Silver Creek. The street below had come alive with ranchers and farmers arriving to sell goods and purchase supplies. Hannah hurried downstairs, her heartbeat a staccato rhythm beneath her corset. Widow Carson was serving coffee to early risers. "Any word from Elk Ridge Ranch?" Hannah asked, trying to keep her voice casual. The widow shook her head. "Early yet. Ranch hands usually come in around noon." The morning stretched endlessly as Hannah alternated between sitting primly in the hotel's small parlor and pacing her room. Each approaching hoofbeat made her start. Each male voice from the street below sent her to the window. When noon came, and went with no word, she forced herself to eat a light lunch, though food tasted like ashes in her mouth. By mid-afternoon, a knot of dread had formed in her stomach. "Sometimes they send a ranch hand named Tucker," Widow Carson offered, unprompted. "Tall fellow, red hair, can't miss him." Hannah stationed herself on the hotel porch, scanning the street. For a tall, red-haired man, she watched as wagons that had arrived that morning began to depart as the bustle of market day gradually subsided. By sunset, she was still waiting, her hope fading with the light. "Maybe they didn't get your letter," the widow suggested as she beckoned Hannah inside for supper. "Or maybe there was trouble at the ranch that needed tending." Hannah nodded, clinging to these reasonable explanations. Yet as darkness fell completely over Silver Creek, she faced a truth she'd been avoiding. Jackson Montgomery knew she was coming. He'd known for weeks. His absence spoke volumes. That night, she placed his letters on the small desk by her window and stared at them for a long time without opening them. The moonlight streaming in cast them in silver, transforming the papers into artifacts from another life, a life she'd imagined but hadn't yet touched. Tomorrow, she decided as she finally slipped beneath the quilt, tomorrow she will find a way to Elk Ridge Ranch. Tomorrow she would face whatever waited for her there, even if it was the end of her dreams before they truly began. Dawn painted the Montana sky in strokes of amber and rose as Hannah secured her borrowed horse to the hitching post outside Elk Ridge Ranch. The journey had taken nearly 3 hours, an eternity of unfamiliar terrain, nervous glances at her hastily drawn map, and the constant company of her own thundering heartbeat. She'd risen before first light, approaching Sam Wilson, the livery stable owner who'd tipped his hat to her the previous day. With a mixture of determination and desperation, she'd negotiated the rental of his gentlest mare, a dappled gray named Willow, and directions to Elk Ridge Ranch. Mr. Wilson had seemed reluctant, his weathered face creasing with an emotion Hannah couldn't quite name. "Maybe wait another day," he'd suggested. "Could Mr. Montgomery have business elsewhere?" But Hannah had set her jaw, handing over precious coins from her dwindling funds. "I've waited long enough." Now, as she stood before the 2-story ranch house with its wide porch and gabled roof, Hannah smoothed her travel-wrinkled skirts and fought to steady her breathing. The house matched Jackson's descriptions, handcrafted with obvious care, solid, without being ostentatious. A thin spiral of smoke rose from the stone chimney, confirmation that someone was home. Nearby a dog barked, and moments later a door creaked open. Hannah turned, expecting, hoping, to finally lay eyes on the man whose words had drawn her across the country. Instead, she found herself face to face with a broad-shouldered man. In his 50s, his salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed, his eyes sharp beneath bushy brows. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked, voice gruff, but not unkind. Hannah lifted her chin slightly. "I'm Hannah Willowbrook. I've come to see Jackson Montgomery." The man's expression shifted, recognition followed by something that looked uncomfortably like pity. "Tucker Reynolds, ma'am. I'm the foreman here." He hesitated. "Mr. Montgomery is down at the east pasture. Should be back for a midday meal." "I'll wait," Hannah said, her tone making it clear this wasn't a request. Tucker nodded, gesturing toward the house. "Mrs. Adler keeps the house. She'll fix you some coffee." The kitchen was warm and fragrant with the smell of baking bread. Mrs. Adler, a stout woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands, said little as she served Hannah coffee, but her glances spoke volumes. They sat in uncomfortable silence, the tick of the mantel clock marking each passing minute like the countdown to an inevitable reckoning. At precisely noon, boots sounded on the porch steps. Hannah's cup rattled against its saucer as the door swung open. Jackson Montgomery stood framed in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, just as his letters had described. His dark hair was swept back from a tanned face, his jaw strong beneath several days' stubble. In another life, Hannah might have found him handsome, but it was his eyes, cold blue and unflinching, that told her everything she needed to know. Before he even spoke, they travelled over her seated figure, lingering on her full cheeks, her substantial frame, before returning to her face with unmistakable disappointment. "Miss Willowbrook," he said, removing his hat. Not a question, he knew exactly who she was. Hannah rose to her feet, suddenly conscious of every inch of her 5'9" frame, of the way her travelling dress pulled slightly at the waist, of the perspiration dampening her collar despite the cool morning. "Mr. Montgomery," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I apologize for arriving unannounced. I was expecting someone to meet me in town." Jackson placed his hat on a hook by the door, his movements deliberate. "Your letter arrived." "I've been busy with the herd." The lie hung between them, transparent and sharp-edged. "Perhaps we could speak privately," Hannah suggested, acutely aware of Mrs. Adler's presence and Tucker hovering near the doorway. Jackson nodded curtly, gesturing toward the front of the house. They walked in silence to a study lined with bookshelves, a room that in other circumstances might have delighted Hannah with its evidence of a shared love of reading. He closed the door and turned to face her, maintaining a distance that spoke volumes. "Miss Willowbrook—" "You're disappointed," Hannah interrupted, refusing to prolong the inevitable. "I'm not what you expected." A muscle twitches in Jackson's jaw. "Your letters were compelling. You describe yourself as sturdy, but You assumed I meant strong of character," Hannah finished for him, "not actually substantial in size." A flush crept up Jackson's neck. "I meant no offense." "And yet offense is given," Hannah replied, surprising herself with the edge in her voice. Jackson moved toward the window, looking out at his land rather than at her. "I built this ranch with my own hands. I work from sunup to sundown. I need a wife who can keep up, who can bear healthy children, who can do what, Mr. Montgomery?" The words escaped before Hannah could contain them. "Who can look decorative when you bring her to town? Who can make other men envy you? I thought we were building a partnership based on shared values and mutual respect." He turned toward her then, his expression hardening. "I apologize if my letters gave you false impressions. This is a hard country. I need a practical match. And I'm not practical because of my size. Hannah felt a peculiar calm settling over her, the kind that comes when the worst has happened and there's nowhere to go but forward. You're an educated woman, Jackson said stiffly. You must understand the attractions, certain compatibilities, they can't be forced. Hannah's throat tightened. The man before her bore little resemblance to the one she'd constructed from his letters, thoughtful, respectful, valuing substance over appearance. Had she imagined it all? Or had Jackson Montgomery crafted a persona as carefully as she'd sewn her best dresses? I understand perfectly, she said finally. You promised one thing in your letters and are delivering another in person. It seems we're both disappointed, Mr. Montgomery. A knock interrupted them. Tucker opened the door without waiting for a response. Sorry to intrude, but there's trouble with the new stallion. Davis can't handle him alone. Jackson looked almost relieved at the interruption. I have to attend to this. We can continue our conversation later. There's nothing more to discuss, Hannah said quietly. Left alone in the study, Hannah moved to the window, watching as Jackson strode toward the stables, his back straight, his steps purposeful. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, feeling the distance between them, a distance no amount of travel could have bridged. She'd crossed a continent for this man, leaving behind everything familiar. She'd pinned her hopes on his words, believing them a true reflection of his character. Now those words lay shattered around her like broken glass, and Hannah stood amid the fragments, bleeding but unbroken. Outside, the Montana landscape stretched vast and indifferent. The mountains didn't care that her heart was splintering. The endless sky took no notice of her humiliation. There was something almost comforting in that indifference, a reminder that her pain, however acute, was temporary against the backdrop of geological time. When Tucker returned to the house an hour later, he found Hannah seated at the study desk, a sheet of paper before her, her handwriting neat despite the circumstances. Miss Willowbrook, Mr. Montgomery asked me to tell you he's arranged for you to stay with Widow Carson until the eastbound stage comes through next week. He'll cover the expenses. Hannah folded the letter carefully, sealing it with a drop of wax from the desktop candle. Please give this to Mr. Montgomery and tell him I'll find my own accommodations. Tucker shifted uncomfortably. It's nearly 15 miles back to town. You shouldn't ride alone this late in the day. I'll manage. At least stay the night, Tucker insisted. Leave at first light. Hannah considered the darkening sky visible through the window. Pride warred with practicality. Very well, but I'll depart at dawn. That night, in a spare bedroom at the far end of the house, as distant from Jackson's quarters as possible, Hannah sat before a small mirror, slowly unpinning her hair. Each pin removed felt like an unmooring, setting her adrift in an ocean of uncertainty. What awaited her now? Return to Massachusetts with her failure displayed for all to see. Attempt to build a life in Silver Creek among people who already viewed her with pity. The options stretched before her, each less appealing than the last. As she braided her hair for sleep, Hannah caught her reflection in the mirror. Eyes bright with unshed tears, chin lifted in defiance. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. This woman looked angry, determined, undefeated. Hannah extinguished the lamp and lay down on the unfamiliar bed. Tomorrow she would leave Elk Ridge Ranch and the shattered remains of her dreams. Tomorrow she will begin the process of rebuilding her life from the ground up, and she would do it without apology for who she was or what she looked like. Dawn had not yet broken when Hannah guided Willow down the winding path from Elk Ridge Ranch. The world existed in shades of blue and grey, with stars still visible in the western sky. She'd left without saying goodbye to Jackson Montgomery. Her carefully worded letter, placed on his desk, said everything necessary. The morning air bit through her woolen shawl, but Hannah barely noticed the cold. A curious numbness had settled. over her, dulling everything except the rhythmic movement of the horse beneath her. She had no destination in mind, no plan beyond putting distance between herself and the ranch. As the sun created the eastern mountains, painting the landscape in watercolor washes of pink and gold, Hannah found herself at a fork in the road. The left path led back to Silver Creek, to whispers and pitying glances from people who'd already heard about Jackson Montgomery's rejected bride. The right path led deeper into unknown territory. She hesitated, her gaze drawn to the mountains, rising blue and distant to the west. What waited for her back in Silver Creek, or further east in Lowell? A lifetime of being seen as nothing more than her physical form, of being measured and found wanting. With a gentle pressure of her knees, Hannah guided Willow to the right. She would not return to Silver Creek, not yet. Not until she'd gathered the scattered pieces of her dignity. The path narrowed as it wound through a stand of ponderosa pines, their scent sharp and clean in the morning air. Hannah lost track of time as Willow picked her way along the unfamiliar trail. Her thoughts drifted in and out like tide pools. Memories of her mother's hands guiding her first stitches, the weight of Jackson's letters against her heart during the journey west, the cold assessment in his eyes when he first saw her. A sound startled her from her reverie. Water flowing over rocks. The trail emerged from the trees onto the bank of a stream that cascaded down from higher elevations, the water clear and swift. Hannah dismounted, allowing Willow to drink while she stretched her aching limbs. Sinking onto a sun-warmed boulder, Hannah finally allowed the tears to come. They fell silently at first, then with increasing force, until sobs racked her body. She cried for the girl who'd left Massachusetts full of hope, for the woman who stood humiliated in a stranger's study, for the future that had disintegrated before her eyes. "I was a fool," she whispered to the uncaring wilderness. "A complete and utter fool." A jay scolded from a nearby branch, its harsh cry echoing Hannah's self-recrimination. She'd built an entire future on words written by a man who'd never even seen her face. She'd traveled 2,000 miles on the strength of promises made by a stranger. What had she been thinking? The answer came with brutal clarity. She'd been thinking that perhaps, just once, someone might value her for something beyond her appearance. That the qualities she possessed, intelligence, kindness, skill with a needle, capacity for hard work, might matter more than the width of her waist or the fullness of her cheeks. "Never again," Hannah vowed, her voice stronger now. "Never again will I apologize for taking up space in this world." As if in response, clouds gathered over the distant peaks, their underbellies dark with the promise of rain. Hannah glanced up, suddenly aware of how far she'd wandered from civilization. She'd brought no provisions, no shelter, nothing beyond. The clothes on her back and the money in her reticule, panic fluttered at the edges of her consciousness. She was alone in unfamiliar territory with a borrowed horse and a storm approaching. This wasn't the independent stance she'd imagined. This was foolishness bordering on dangerous. Hannah rose quickly, gathering Willow's reins. She needed to find shelter to regroup and form a plan. As she mounted, fat raindrops began to pelt down, quickly soaking through her shawl. The temperature dropped precipitously as the storm rolled in, bringing with it wind that whipped at her skirts and sent her hat tumbling across the ground. Lightning cracked across the sky, followed almost immediately by a boom of thunder that spooked Willow. The mare reared, nearly unseating Hannah, who clung desperately to the saddle horn. Another lightning strike illuminated the landscape in stark white, and Willow bolted, fear overriding her training. Hannah fought for control, pulling on the reins, while trying to stay mounted as the horse plunged through the underbrush. Branches whipped at her face. Her skirt caught and tore on a jutting rock. Just as she thought she'd regained control, Willow's hoof caught in a hidden hole. The horse stumbled, pitching forward. Hannah felt herself airborne for one terrifying Moment before impact drove the breath from her lungs. Pain exploded through her right side as she rolled down a short, muddy embankment. When she came to rest, face down in sodden earth, the world spun around her. She lay motionless, assessing the damage. Sharp pain in her ribs, a throbbing ankle, cuts stinging on her cheek and hands. Nothing seemed broken, but every movement sent fresh waves of discomfort through her body. Gradually, Hannah became aware that Willow was nowhere to be seen. The frightened mare had either continued running or found shelter somewhere else. Either way, Hannah was now completely alone, injured in the middle of a fierce mountain storm. "Get up!" she commanded herself, voice barely audible above the downpour. "You have to get up." Rolling onto her knees, Hannah gasped as pain shot through her side. Her dress was ruined, the right side caked with mud, a long tear exposing her petticoat. Her hair had come completely undone, hanging in wet ropes around her face. Using a nearby sapling for support, Hannah pulled herself upright. She needed shelter. Immediately. The temperature continued to drop, and her wet clothing offered little protection. Already she could feel shivers beginning, her teeth chattering with cold and shock. Lightning illuminated the landscape again, and in that brief flash, Hannah spotted what looked like an outcropping of rock about 50 yards uphill. It wasn't much, but it might offer some protection from the worst of the elements. Every step was agony as Hannah limped uphill, slipping in the mud, clutching at branches for support. Rain pelted her face, mixing with tears of pain and frustration. By the time she reached the rock formation, her breath came in ragged gasps. The outcropping turned out to be better than she'd hoped. A shallow cave created where massive boulders had collapsed against each other centuries ago. It wasn't deep, but it was dry, the interior untouched by the rain lashing the entrance. Hannah crawled inside, collapsing onto the dirt floor. For long minutes she simply lay there, listening to the storm rage outside, feeling the ache of her battered body. As the initial shock began to wear off, rational thought returned. She needed to take inventory of her situation. Her reticule was miraculously still attached to her wrist. Inside were her remaining funds, enough for perhaps a week at modest accommodations. A handkerchief, a small sewing kit she carried by habit, and the stub of a pencil. Her shawl was gone, lost somewhere during the wild ride. Her boots were soaked through, her dress beyond repair. Shelter, fire, water, food, the basics of survival that she'd read about in adventure novels but never expected to need. She had shelter of a sort. Water was abundant, though she had no way to collect it. Food and fire seemed impossible given her current resources. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped further. Hannah huddled against the cave wall, wrapping her arms around herself for warmth. She'd never felt so utterly alone, so completely untethered from everything familiar. In Lowell, even after her mother's death, she'd been surrounded by a community. Mrs. Donovan bringing up bread when Hannah worked late, Mr. Jensen inquiring after her health when she visited the bank, even the mill girls who sometimes sought her out for mending. She'd taken those small connections for granted, never realizing how they formed a safety net beneath her solitary existence. Now, shivering in a strange cave in a wild land, Hannah faced the stark reality of her situation. No one knew where she was. No one was coming to her aid. If she was to survive this crisis, it would be entirely through her own efforts. "One problem at a time," she whispered, her mother's favorite saying when facing overwhelming circumstances. Just solve one problem at a time. The first problem was cold. Without fire, her wet clothing would become deadly as night deepened. Hannah began the painful process of removing her outer garments, wringing out as much water as possible before spreading them on rocks to dry. In her chemise and petticoat, she used her one dry handkerchief to blot moisture from her hair and skin. Then, gathering all her courage, she began to explore the deeper recesses of the cave, hoping to find something, anything, that might aid. Her survival through what promised to be the longest night of her life. Dawn arrived with merciful warmth after a night that had stretched endlessly. Hannah had slept fitfully, waking often to shift her position on the unyielding stone floor, her body stiff with cold and pain. The storm had passed sometime during the night, leaving behind a pristine sky washed clean of clouds. Hannah crawled to the cave entrance, wincing as her bruised ribs protested. The landscape glistened, droplets of water clinging to pine needles and catching the early sunlight like scattered diamonds. Under different circumstances, she might have found it beautiful. Her dress had dried somewhat overnight, but remained, stained and torn beyond repair. She dressed slowly, each movement deliberate, cataloguing her injuries, bruised ribs, a swollen ankle, palms scraped raw from her fall. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to make travel difficult. The most pressing problem was clear: she needed to find civilization. Without Willow, she faced a lengthy walk, possibly miles through unfamiliar terrain. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since a light breakfast the previous day. One foot in front of the other, Hannah murmured, her voice rough from thirst. Using a sturdy branch as a makeshift walking stick, she set out, following the stream downhill. Water always led to settlements. She'd read that somewhere. The going was slow, her ankle protesting each step on the uneven ground. She paused often to rest, sipping from the clear stream to quench her thirst. By mid-morning, the sun beat down relentlessly. Hannah removed her ruined shawl, tying it around her waist to keep her hands free. Her hair hung loose down her back. She'd lost most of her pins during the fall. She must look a sight, a far cry, from the neat, respectable woman who had arrived in Silver Creek just days ago. The wilderness stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful but indifferent to her plight. Hannah had never felt so small, so insignificant. Back east, nature had been tamed, contained in parks and gardens. Here it dominated, making no concessions to human frailty. As noon approached, bringing with it a punishing heat, Hannah's strength began to ebb. Her pace slowed further, each step requiring concentrated effort. Spots danced before her eyes, from hunger, exhaustion, or both. She sank onto a fallen log, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. Perhaps she should have swallowed her pride and returned to Silver Creek, endured the whispers and pity. A sound caught her attention, the distant but unmistakable creak of wagon wheels. Hannah rose too quickly, gasping as pain shot through her side. Gathering her remaining strength, she moved toward the sound, pushing through a thicket of brush. The stream she'd been following curved around a bend, and there, not 50 yards away, was a rutted dirt road. Relief weakened her knees. She wasn't as far from civilization as she'd feared. Hannah limped toward the road just as a wagon appeared, driven by an elderly man with a snow-white beard. Beside him sat a woman of similar age, her grey hair tucked beneath a practical bonnet. "Help!" Hannah called, her voice cracking. "Please!" The wagon slowed, the couple staring at her with undisguised shock. Hannah knew she must present a frightening image. Clothing torn and muddied, hair wild, face scratched. "Good Lord above," the woman exclaimed, climbing down from the wagon with surprising agility. "What's happened to you, child?" Hannah opened her mouth to explain, but exhaustion and relief overwhelmed her. The world tilted alarmingly, and darkness crept in at the edges of her vision. The last thing she remembered was the women's weathered hands reaching out to catch her. She woke to the scent of herbs and wood smoke and the gentle pressure of a cool cloth on her forehead. Hannah blinked, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. A small bedroom with simple furnishings, sunlight filtering through gingham curtains. "Ah, you're back with us." The woman from the wagon stood beside the bed, her lined face creased with concern. Up close, Hannah could see kind eyes, the color of walnuts, and a mouth accustomed to smiling. "Where am I?" Hannah's voice sounded foreign to her own ears. Clearwater Farm. I'm Abigail Parker. My husband Ezekiel and I found you on the road. Memory flooded back. The storm, the night in the cave, the desperate trek through the wilderness. How long have I been here? Since yesterday noon. You were suffering from exhaustion and exposure, not to mention these injuries. Abigail gestured to Hannah's bandaged hands and ankle. I've been a midwife for 40 years. I know a bit about tending the sick. Hannah struggled to sit up, acutely aware of her disheveled state. I'm so sorry to impose. Nonsense, Abigail interrupted firmly. We couldn't leave you there. Now I've drawn a bath for you and laid out some clean clothing. They belonged to our daughter Sarah before she married and moved to Oregon. They might be a bit short, but they'll do until yours are properly cleaned. Tears sprang to Hannah's eyes at this simple kindness. Thank you. I don't know how I'll repay you. Abigail patted her hand. We'll talk about that after you've bathed and eaten. You look half-starved, poor thing. The bath was heaven. Warm water soothing. Hannah's battered body, washing away dirt and painful memories alike. The borrowed dress was indeed too short, ending inches above her ankles, but the fabric was soft and clean against her skin. When Hannah emerged from the bedroom, she found Abigail in the kitchen, setting a steaming bowl of stew on the table. An older man, Ezekiel, she presumed, sat nearby, his weathered face creasing into a smile as he spotted her. There she is, he said, rising politely. Feeling better, miss? Willowbrook. Hannah Willowbrook. She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal about her circumstances. Sit and eat, Miss Willowbrook, Abigail urged. Questions can wait until you've got some strength back. The stew was the most delicious thing Hannah had ever tasted, rich with vegetables from the Parker's garden and tender chunks of beef. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware of her host's curious glances. I don't know how to thank you both, Hannah said, once she'd finished. If you hadn't come along when you did, the Lord works in mysterious ways, Ezekiel replied, his tone matter-of-fact. Now, if you're feeling up to it, perhaps you might tell us how a well-spoken young woman ended up alone and injured on a remote mountain road. Hannah took a deep breath. These kind people deserved the truth. I came west to marry a man I'd never met, Mr. Jackson Montgomery of Elk Ridge Ranch. Recognition flickered in Abigail's eyes. Montgomery? Cattle rancher about 20 miles north? Yes. He'd advertised for a bride. We exchanged letters for months. Hannah's voice grew steadier as she continued, relating her journey, her arrival in Silver Creek, and Jackson's cold rejection. She didn't mention her humiliation or tears, but something in Abigail's expression suggested the older woman understood nonetheless. So you ran, Ezekiel said when she finished. Not a judgment, a simple statement of fact. I couldn't face returning. To Silver Creek, where everyone would know, and I had nowhere else to go. Abigail and Ezekiel exchanged glances, a silent communication born of decades together. Well, Abigail said finally, it seems clear what needs to happen next. You'll stay with us until you're properly healed. Then we'll figure out the rest. I couldn't possibly. We've got the room, Ezekiel interrupted. Our children are grown and gone. Place is too quiet these days. I have some money, Hannah offered. I could pay for the board. Abigail waved this away. We'll discuss arrangements later. For now, you need rest. That evening, sitting on the Parker's porch as sunset painted the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold, Hannah felt something loose inside her chest. For the first time since stepping off the train in Silver Creek, she could breathe without the weight of expectation pressing down on her. It's a hard country, Abigail said, settling into the rocking chair beside Hannah's, but beautiful in its way. Hannah nodded, watching as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. I never imagined such vastness. In Massachusetts, everything is close, contained, takes some getting used to. Abigail's needles clicked rhythmically as she knitted. Space can make a person feel small, or it can make them feel free, depends on how you look at it. Free, the word resonates deep within Hannah. She'd come west bound by expectations, Jackson's, society's, her own. Perhaps this unexpected detour was an opportunity to discover what freedom might actually mean. "Thank you," Hannah said quietly, "not just for taking me in, for not asking more questions." Abigail's hands stilled momentarily. "Everyone has a story, child. Not my place to pry. But if you ever want to talk, these old ears work just fine." As darkness settled fully over Clearwater Farm, Hannah watched fireflies dancing in the meadow beyond the porch. For the first time since Jackson Montgomery's cold appraisal, she didn't feel judged for the space she occupied in the world. Here, in this temporary shelter with strangers who had shown more kindness than she could have hoped for, Hannah glimpsed the possibility of building something new from the wreckage of her plans, something that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or expectations. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. But tonight, wrapped in borrowed clothes and unexpected kindness, Hannah allowed herself to believe that she might yet find her place in this vast, unforgiving, beautiful country. Days at Clearwater Farm settled into a rhythm as Hannah's injuries healed. Each morning she woke to roosters crowing and the scent of coffee brewing. Each evening she sat with the Parkers on their porch, watching darkness claim the valley while sharing stories of their very different lives. By the end of her first week, Hannah's restlessness grew. The Parkers had been unfailingly kind, asking for nothing in return for their hospitality. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling of being a burden, a feeling all too familiar from her years caring for her ailing mother. "I'm not accustomed to idleness," Hannah confessed to Abigail one morning as they shelled peas at the kitchen table. "In Lowell, I worked every day. Even Sundays sometimes." Abigail studied her thoughtfully. "Your hands seem restless without work." "I've been a seamstress since I was 16, Hannah explained. "There's comfort in creating something useful, something beautiful." Later that afternoon, Abigail appeared in the doorway of Hannah's room carrying a large wooden box. "Thought you might be interested in this," she said, placing it on the bed. "Been gathering dust in the attic since Sarah left." Inside, Hannah discovered a treasure trove of sewing supplies, fine needles, spools of thread in every color, buttons and ribbons and lace, even lengths of fabric still wrapped in brown paper. "Sarah was clever with a needle like you," Abigail explained. "Planned to open a dress shop in town before she fell in love with that logger and moved west." Hannah ran her fingers over the fabrics, soft flannel, sturdy cotton, even a length of blue silk that caught the light. "This is too generous. It's only gathering moths up there." Abigail patted her shoulder. "Besides, Ezekiel's shirts are nearly threadbare, and my eyes aren't what they used to be for fine stitching." That evening, Hannah inventoried her newfound resources, planning repairs to the Parkers' clothing as her first contribution to the household. As her fingers traced patterns and measured seams, something within her began to knit back together, not completely healed, but no longer raw and bleeding. The following morning, Hannah rose earlier than usual, eager to begin. She started with Ezekiel's workshirts, reinforcing worn elbows, replacing missing buttons, and mending small tears. By midday, she had completed 3 shirts and turned her attention to a pile of Abigail's aprons, adding decorative stitching along the pockets and hems. When the Parkers returned from their visit to a neighboring farm, Hannah presented her work with shy pride. Ezekiel's weathered face broke into a delighted smile as he examined his rejuvenated shirts. "Fine work, Miss Willowbrook," he said, running calloused fingers over the nearly invisible mending. "I don't believe they looked this good when they were new." Abigail's reaction to her embellished aprons was equally enthusiastic. "Such delicate stitches, and these little flowers along the pocket. Why, I'll be the envy of every woman at church." For the first time since arriving in Montana Territory, Hannah felt a small spark of pride. Her skills still had value here, even if her appearance had been deemed wanting by Jackson Montgomery. Over the next few days, Hannah expanded her efforts, altering a dress of Sarah's to fit Abigail better, hemming curtains that had long dragged on the floor, and repairing a cherished quilt that had begun to unravel at the seams. "You've got a gift," Abigail declared, admiring the quilt Hannah had restored. "In all my years, I've never seen such fine, even stitches." A thought began to form in Hannah's mind, nebulous at first, then gaining clarity with each passing day. If her skills were valued here at Clearwater Farm, perhaps they would be valued elsewhere in the territory. "Do you suppose," she asked Ezekiel over supper one evening, "there might be a need for a seamstress in these parts?" Ezekiel considered the question while buttering a slice of bread. "Silver Creek's growing fast. Mrs. Peterson at the hotel mends. A bit, but she's getting on in years, and folks are always needing work done, clothes made or altered, household linens repaired." "Of course," Abigail added, "there's no dedicated dressmaker yet. Women either make their own or order from catalogs, have to wait months." Hannah's pulse quickened. "And what about Pine Hollow? You mentioned it's larger than Silver Creek." "Twice the size at least," Ezekiel confirmed. "Has a proper hotel, 2. Saloons instead of 1, even a small theater for traveling shows. More prosperous overall." "And farther from Elk Ridge Ranch," Abigail added quietly, giving Hannah a knowing look. That night, Hannah lay awake, her mind racing with possibilities. She had skills, she had experience, and thanks to the Parkers' generosity, she had materials to start with. What she lacked was a plan, a way to establish herself in a strange town with no connections and limited funds. The next morning, Hannah borrowed paper from Abigail and began making calculations. She estimated the cost of room and board in a growing frontier town, adding figures for additional supplies she might need. Her remaining funds would last perhaps a month, possibly 2 if she was frugal. Not long, but perhaps long enough to establish herself if she found enough work quickly. She would need to be bold, to approach potential customers directly rather than waiting for them to find her. The thought made her stomach tighten. She'd always let her work speak for itself rather than promoting her services. But this wasn't Massachusetts. This was Montana Territory, where survival required adaptation. Over breakfast, Hannah shared her emerging plan with the Parkers. "I believe I could establish myself as a seamstress in Pine Hollow. It would mean starting over completely, but it's a solid plan," Ezekiel interrupted, nodding approval. "You've got skills that are needed, and Pine Hollow's growing fast enough that newcomers don't face as much scrutiny." "You'd need a place to stay, workspace," Abigail mused. "Mrs. Thornton, she's my second cousin, runs a boarding house there. Clean, respectable place, mostly for single women working at the hotel or school. And she might need some mending done herself," Ezekiel added with a wink. "Way to get your foot in the door." Hannah felt a rush of gratitude for these people who had become more than just benefactors. They were becoming friends, allies in her reinvention. "I don't know how to thank you both," she began. "Pish," Abigail said, waving away her words. "We've done nothing but provide a roof and meals. You're the one doing the hard work of rebuilding." That afternoon, Hannah took the repaired quilt and spread it beneath a towering pine tree near the creek that gave Clearwater Farm its name. Lying on her back, she watched clouds drift across the vast Montana sky and allowed herself, for the first time, to imagine a future different from the one she'd planned. Not a rancher's wife, but an independent woman with her own business. The possibilities both exhilarated and terrified her. In Lowell, she'd known her place, understood the limitations and expectations. Here, the very openness of her future left her breathless. When Ezekiel announced at supper that he would be traveling to Pine Hollow the following week to deliver lumber to the expanding hotel, Hannah knew it was a sign. The universe was offering a path forward, however uncertain. I could accompany you, she suggested, trying to sound casual despite her pounding heart. Meet Mrs. Thornton, perhaps inquire about rooms. Fine idea, Ezekiel agreed. About time you saw more of the territory than our little corner of it. That night Hannah began preparations in earnest. She altered one of Sarah's dresses to fit her larger frame, adding panels to the sides and letting out the seams with such skill that the modifications were nearly invisible. She created a portfolio of sorts, with samples of her different stitches, embroidery patterns, and design sketches. More importantly, she began crafting a new narrative for herself, not the rejected mail-order bride, not the spinster seamstress from Lowell, but Hannah Willowbrook, skilled dressmaker newly arrived from the East to establish her business in the growing town of Pine Hollow. With each stitch, with each careful plan, Hannah rebuilt not just her future prospects, but her sense of self-worth. Her hands, always her most reliable asset, would forge a path where Jackson Montgomery's rejection had created only emptiness. As she worked late into the night, the light from her lamp casting long shadows across the bedroom floor, Hannah allowed herself a small, private smile. For the first time since receiving Jackson's first letter, she was creating a future based entirely on her own vision, her own abilities, and the foundation felt more solid than any promise made by a man she'd never met. Pine Hollow materialized on the horizon like something from a storybook, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley between rolling hills, smoke curling from chimneys against the clear blue sky. As Ezekiel's wagon rumbled down the main street, Hannah took in every detail with wide eyes. Unlike Silver Creek's single dusty thoroughfare, Pine Hollow boasted multiple streets branching from the town center, businesses with painted signs and glass windows and sidewalks raised above the muddy road. Women in colorful dresses moved purposefully between shops, some nodding politely to Hannah as the wagon passed. "Bigger than I expected," Hannah murmured, suddenly conscious of her mended dress and simple bonnet among the relatively fashionable attire of Pine Hollow's female residents. "Grown considerably since I first came through," Ezekiel agreed. "Silver. Mine opened up in the hills last year, brought in all sorts of folks." He guided the wagon to a two-story building with a freshly painted sign, "Thornton Boarding House, respectable accommodations for ladies." The structure stood on the corner of Main and Cedar Streets, its location ideal for Hannah's purposes. Central, but not directly on the busiest thoroughfare. Mrs. Eleanor Thornton proved to be the opposite of her cousin Abigail in nearly every way. Tall and thin, where Abigail was short and rounded, brisk and businesslike where Abigail was warm and nurturing. Her grey hair was pulled into a severe bun, her black dress unadorned, except for a silver watch pinned to her bodice. "So you're a seamstress," she said after introductions were made, examining Hannah with shrewd eyes. "From Massachusetts," Abigail writes. "Yes, ma'am. I specialized in wedding gowns and formal attire, but I'm skilled in all types of garment construction. And repair." Mrs. Thornton nodded once, decisively. "Pine Hollow's been needing a proper dressmaker. Mrs. Collins at the Mercantile does some basic work, but nothing fine. And the ladies from the mining families are always wanting something new to wear to church socials." Relief flooded through Hannah. "Then you believe there might be sufficient work?" "Oh, I've no doubt about that." Mrs. Thornton led them through a parlor where two young women sat reading. "The question is space. I've a room available for boarding, but nowhere suitable for conducting business." Hannah's heart sank. She hadn't considered this aspect of establishing herself. "I see. Perhaps there's a storefront to rent in town?" "Not on your budget, I'd wager." Mrs. Thornton's shrewd eyes took in Hannah's modest attire. "However, I may have a solution. The sunroom at the back of the house has stood empty since my husband passed. Good light, separate entrance from the garden. Would need cleaning, perhaps a fresh coat of paint. I could do that." Hannah said quickly, hope resurging. And I could contribute extra toward the rent. Let me think on it, Mrs. Thornton replied, neither accepting nor rejecting the proposal. First, let's get you settled. You'll stay for supper. Ezekiel, Eleanor's making her venison stew. That evening, Hannah was introduced to the boarding house's other residents, Miss Sophia Grant, the town's schoolteacher, Miss Amelia Porter, who worked as bookkeeper at her uncle's hardware store, and Mrs. Viola Winston, a widow who played piano at the Pine Hollow Hotel 3 evenings a week. The women regarded Hannah with polite curiosity, asking about her journey west and her plans for establishing a dressmaking business. Hannah provided carefully edited answers, omitting any mention of Jackson Montgomery or her original reason for coming to Montana Territory. "We've been desperate for a skilled seamstress," declared Mrs. Winston, a plump, cheerful woman in her 50s. "I've been sending to Denver for my performance gowns, and the shipping costs are outrageous. Not to mention when things arrive the wrong size or color," added Miss Porter, a serious young woman with spectacles perched on her nose. "Do you design children's clothing as well?" inquired Miss Grant. "Some of my students could use proper winter attire before the snows come." By the end of the meal, Hannah had received tentative commissions from all 3 women, contingent on Mrs. Thornton's decision about the sunroom. As they moved to the parlor for tea, Hannah felt a tentative optimism taking root. These women weren't just potential customers. They could become allies, perhaps even friends. "Show them your work," Ezekiel encouraged, when Hannah hesitated to open her portfolio. "Finest stitching I've seen since my mother's day." With nervous fingers, Hannah displayed her samples, the intricate embroidery, the nearly invisible mending, the delicate lacework. The women examined each piece with appreciation, passing them carefully from hand to hand. "Extraordinary," murmured Miss Grant. "Such precision." "And you've a good eye for color," added Mrs. Winston, admiring a piece of embroidery featuring birds among blossoming branches. Even Mrs. Thornton seemed impressed. "My Abigail didn't exaggerate your talents. This settles it. The sunroom is yours if you want it. We can discuss terms tomorrow after you've seen it properly." That night, in the small but comfortable room that would be her home for the foreseeable future, Hannah wrote in her journal for the first time since leaving Massachusetts. The words flowed easily, documenting not just the events of the day, but the cautious hope blooming within her. The next morning, Mrs. Thornton showed Hannah the sunroom, a glass-enclosed space overlooking a small but well-tended garden. Dust covered the surfaces, and a few panes needed replacing, but Hannah immediately saw its potential. Sunlight streamed through the windows, providing perfect illumination for detailed work. The separate entrance would allow customers to come and go without disturbing the boarding house residents. "It needs work," Mrs. Thornton acknowledged, "but it could serve your purposes nicely." "It's perfect," Hannah breathed, already envisioning a cutting table by the largest window, a fitting area with mirrors, displays of fabric samples and design sketches. They agreed on terms, a slightly higher room and board rate, plus a percentage of Hannah's earnings in exchange for the use of the sunroom and meals with the household. Hannah would be responsible for renovating the space, but Mrs. Thornton would supply basic materials. "My nephew Daniel can help with the repairs," Mrs. Thornton added. "He does odd jobs around town, a trustworthy young man if a bit quiet." The following days passed in a flurry of activity. Hannah scrubbed the sunroom from floor to ceiling, washed windows until they sparkled, and helped Daniel, a tall, lanky young man who rarely spoke more than 3 words together, repair the broken glass panes and wobbly shelving. Miss Porter brought fabric remnants from her uncle's store to cover a battered armchair. Miss Grant appeared one afternoon with 2 of her older female students in tow, offering their help in exchange for sewing lessons. Mrs. Winston contributed a mirror rescued from the hotel's storage room, slightly tarnished, but large enough for fittings, Each small kindness astonished Hannah. In Lowell, she'd lived alongside neighbors for years without experiencing such community spirit. Here in Pine Hollow, where she was a stranger, people opened their doors and extended their hands. Without hesitation. Frontier life requires cooperation, Mrs. Thornton explained when Hannah expressed her surprise. We all benefit when newcomers succeed, especially those bringing needed skills. By the end of her first week in Pine Hollow, Hannah had transformed the neglected sunroom into a serviceable dressmaking shop. A careful sign in the front window announced H. Willowbrook, fine dressmaking and alterations, and she'd already scheduled fittings with 5 potential customers in addition to the boarding house residents. On Sunday, Hannah attended services. At Pine Hollow's small church, Mrs. Thornton introduced her to Reverend Collins and his wife, who immediately commissioned a christening gown for their expected child. After the service, several women approached, curious about the new dressmaker in town. Among them was Mrs. Margaret Beaumont, wife of the bank manager and self-appointed arbiter of Pine Hollow society. She examined Hannah through a silver lorgnette, her gaze lingering on Hannah's full figure and simple dress. "We do need someone with proper Eastern training," she declared finally. "My daughters require new gowns for the harvest dance. Perhaps you could call at the house tomorrow to discuss designs." That evening, as Hannah sat on the boarding house porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk, she marveled at how quickly her circumstances had changed. In just over 2 weeks, she had journeyed from the depths of rejection and despair to the threshold of a new beginning. Miss Grant joined her, offering a cup of tea. "You seem pensive tonight." Hannah accepted the tea with a smile. "Just reflecting on life's unexpected turns." "We all have stories," Miss Grant said quietly. "What brought us here, what we left behind." She didn't pry further, but her gentle presence offered a silent invitation. "When you're ready to share, I'm ready to listen." As stars appeared in the darkening sky, Hannah felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not quite belonging. Not yet, but the possibility of it. These tentative connections, these small kindnesses exchanged with strangers becoming acquaintances, were weaving a new safety net beneath her. One thread at a time, one conversation, one shared cup of tea on a porch at twilight. She was finding her place in this new world. And with each new connection, Jackson Montgomery's rejection receded further into the past, losing its power to wound her. October arrived in Pine Hollow with a brilliant display of autumn colors and a sharp chill in the morning air. Hannah's modest dressmaking business had grown steadily over the past 3 weeks, her appointment book filling with commissions ranging from simple alterations to elaborate gowns for the upcoming harvest dance. The sunroom had been transformed into a proper workshop, with fabric samples displayed on newly installed shelves, a sturdy cutting table positioned to catch the best light, and a privacy screen in the corner for fittings. Mrs. Winston had contributed curtains that could be drawn for additional privacy, and Miss Porter had convinced her uncle to craft a beautiful wooden sign for the garden entrance. "You need to order more supplies," Mrs. Thornton observed one evening as Hannah sorted through her dwindling collection of threads and notions. "The mercantile stock is limited for specialized items." Hannah nodded, making calculations in her ledger. Her business was growing faster than anticipated, leaving her little time to replenish materials. "Perhaps I could place an order with Harrigan's in Silver Creek. I've heard their selection is more extensive." "Better yet, go yourself," Mrs. Thornton suggested. "The Wilsons are driving to Silver Creek tomorrow for the livestock auction. I'm sure they'd be happy to take you along." Hannah's stomach tightened at the thought of returning to Silver Creek, where her Montana story had begun so disastrously. Though the town was sizable enough that she might avoid unwanted encounters, the Risk of running into someone who knew about her history with Jackson Montgomery made her palms sweat. Yet her practical side prevailed. She needed supplies, and seeing items in person would be vastly preferable to ordering by description, especially for the specialty fabrics Mrs. Beaumont had requested for her daughter's gowns. That's a sensible suggestion, Hannah agreed, masking her apprehension. I'll speak with the Wilsons tonight. The journey to Silver Creek the following morning passed pleasantly enough. Mrs. Wilson, a cheerful woman with apple-red cheeks, chatted about her 5 children, while her husband guided the wagon along the winding road. Hannah listened attentively, grateful for the distraction from her own thoughts. Silver Creek appeared unchanged from Hannah's previous visit, though she viewed it now through different eyes. What had seemed intimidating now looked merely quaint. What had felt overwhelming now appeared manageable. Amazing how perspective could shift in just a few short weeks. We'll meet back here at 3 o'clock, Mr. Wilson said, as he helped Hannah down from the wagon outside Harrigan's Mercantile. Unless you finish earlier. 3 should be perfect, Hannah assured him. She smoothed her skirts, a new dress she'd made herself from forest green wool, tailored to flatter her figure rather than disguise it, and entered the Mercantile with determined steps. The store was larger than Pine Hollow's establishment, its shelves stocked with everything from kitchen implements to bolts of fabric. Hannah moved purposefully toward the dry goods section, consulting her list as she selected spools of thread, packets of needles, and other necessities. She was examining a bolt of blue silk when a deep voice behind her asked, "Might I help you?" "Find something specific, ma'am." Hannah turned, coming face to face with a man she hadn't noticed upon entering. He stood behind the counter, tall and broad-shouldered, with warm brown eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard sprinkled with grey, despite his relatively young face. "I'm looking for specialty fabrics," Hannah explained, suddenly conscious of the man's appreciative gaze. "Silk, fine wool, perhaps some lace trim." "For a special occasion?" he inquired, moving around the counter to join her in the fabric section. "I'm a dressmaker," Hannah clarified, "from Pine Hollow." Interest flickered in the man's expression. "Pine Hollow, you say? I wasn't aware they had a dressmaker." "It's a recent development." Hannah offered a small smile. "Hannah Willowbrook." "Matthew." "Harrigan." He extended his hand, his handshake firm but not overpowering. "This is my establishment." For the next hour, Matthew guided Hannah through his inventory, pulling out fabrics she hadn't initially noticed, suggesting combinations, even retrieving special items from the storeroom. His knowledge impressed her. Many male shopkeepers barely understood their fabric stock, but Matthew spoke confidently about weaves, durability, and suitability for different garments. "You know a great deal about textiles," Hannah remarked, as he showed her an exquisite length of cream-colored lace. Matthew's smile revealed a dimple in his right cheek. "My mother was a dressmaker before her eyesight failed. I grew up surrounded by fabrics and fashion plates. This shared connection shifted their interaction from purely commercial to something more personal. As Matthew helped Hannah select her purchases, they exchanged stories about the challenges of fitting difficult clients and sourcing rare materials. "I don't suppose you carry silk velvet?" Hannah inquired, consulting her notes on Mrs. Beaumont's requirements. Her description was quite specific. "Not in stock, but I can order it." Matthew leaned against the counter, studying her with undisguised interest. "It will arrive in about 2 weeks. Would you be returning to Silver Creek then?" The question carried a subtle weight that Hannah didn't miss. "Perhaps, though it's quite a journey from Pine Hollow." "I deliver to Pine Hollow on the first Monday of each month," Matthew offered, "for the hotel and Mrs. Collins at the schoolhouse. I could bring your order directly to you." Hannah considered this practical solution, trying to ignore the flutter in her chest at the prospect of seeing Matthew again. "That would be most convenient, thank you." As Matthew tallied her purchases, Hannah noticed a book lying open beside the ledger. a collection of poetry by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. The unexpected discovery of literature in a frontier mercantile surprised her. "Do you enjoy poetry?" she asked, nodding toward the book. Matthew glanced up, a faint flush coloring his cheeks. "My guilty pleasure during quiet afternoons." "Do you read poetry, Miss Willowbrook?" "When I can find it," Hannah admitted. "Books were easier to come by in Massachusetts." "I have quite a collection," Matthew said, wrapping her purchases in brown paper with careful hands. "Advantages of ordering. Inventory for a store. I can add personal items to the shipments." Their conversation flowed naturally as Matthew completed her transaction, moving from literature to music to the differences between Eastern and Western landscapes. When Hannah glanced at the clock, she was startled to discover nearly 2 hours had passed. "I've taken too much of your time," she apologized, gathering her packages. "Not at all." Matthew's smile seemed genuine. "It's refreshing to converse with someone who appreciates more than the price of nails or the durability of boot leather." He helped her carry her purchases outside, where the Wilsons' wagon was nowhere in sight. "It seems your transportation isn't here yet," Matthew observed. "Would you care for some tea while you wait? My living quarters are just above the store." The invitation was perfectly respectable, yet Hannah hesitated. She barely knew this man, despite their pleasant conversation. "Thank you, but I should probably wait here. The Wilsons might arrive early." If Matthew was disappointed, he didn't show it. "Of course. At least let me bring a chair for you." He disappeared briefly into the store, returning with a wooden chair, which he placed in the shade of the awning. More comfortable than standing, Hannah seated herself gratefully. "You're very kind, Mr. Harrigan." "Matthew, please." He remained standing, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Willowbrook, I hope you won't think me too forward, but I find myself reluctant to wait until next month to continue our conversation." Hannah's pulse quickened. "Oh, I'll be attending the harvest dance in Pine Hollow. The mayor is a good-paying customer, and he extends an invitation each year." Matthew adjusted his spectacles, a gesture Hannah was beginning to recognize as a sign of slight nervousness. "Perhaps I might call on you while I'm there. We could discuss your velvet order." The rare, transparent excuse made Hannah smile. "I would like that." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only when the Wilsons' wagon appeared at the end of the street. Matthew helped load Hannah's packages and tipped his hat as the wagon pulled away. "Made a friend, did you?" Mrs. Wilson asked, her tone gently teasing as Silver Creek receded behind them. "Mr. Harrigan was very helpful with my purchases," Hannah replied, striving for a neutral tone despite the warmth in her cheeks. "I'm sure he was," Mrs. Wilson said with a knowing smile. "Matthew Harrigan has been the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties since his wife passed 5 years ago. Never shown much interest in remarrying, from what I hear." Hannah absorbed this information silently, watching the landscape roll by. Her trip to Silver Creek had yielded not just the supplies she needed, but an unexpected encounter that left her thoughtful. Matthew Harrigan wasn't at all what she had expected to find in a frontier shopkeeper. Educated, courteous, with interests beyond mere commerce. Most surprising of all had been the way he'd looked at her. Not with the cold assessment Jackson Montgomery had subjected her to, but with genuine interest in her thoughts, her words, herself. He'd seen her as a whole person, not merely a body to be judged and found wanting. As the wagon crested a hill, Hannah caught a distant glimpse of Pine Hollow nestled in its valley. For the first time, the sight filled her with something approaching contentment. She had built the beginnings of a life there, not the life she had planned when leaving Massachusetts, but perhaps a better one. And now, unexpectedly, a new possibility had presented itself. Not a promise, not even an expectation, but a door opening just enough to let in a shaft of light. The weeks leading up to the harvest dance transformed Pine Hollow. Garlands of autumn leaves and dried corn husks appeared on doorways. pumpkins lined the boardwalks, and excitement hummed through conversations at the boarding house dinner table. For Hannah, these weeks brought a flurry of activity. Final fittings for the Beaumont girls' gowns, alterations on dance dresses for half the women in town, and the creation of her own gown for the occasion. "You've barely slept," Mrs. Winston observed one evening, finding Hannah still at work in the sunroom, well past midnight. "These commissions will mean nothing if you collapse from exhaustion." Hannah smiled tiredly, setting aside her needle. "Just one more seam on Charlotte Beaumont's gown. Mrs. Beaumont will be here at 9 tomorrow for the final fitting." "And your own dress? Is it finished?" Hannah gestured toward a garment draped carefully over a mannequin in the corner, a gown of deep burgundy wool, with delicate embroidery at the bodice and cuffs. She'd chosen the color deliberately, knowing it complemented her chestnut hair and fair skin. "It's beautiful," Mrs. Winston said softly, running her fingers over the intricate embroidery. "You've put more care into others' gowns than your own." "I wanted something dignified," Hannah explained. "Not too showy, but well made." What she didn't say was how much thought she'd given to Matthew Harrigan's potential reaction. Would he find her beautiful? Or would he, like Jackson Montgomery, see only her size? These thoughts plagued her in quiet moments, though she tried to dismiss them. Matthew's interest might be purely business-related, despite Mrs. Wilson's hints to the contrary. One pleasant conversation didn't constitute a courtship. The morning of the harvest dance dawned clear and cool. Hannah completed her final deliveries before noon, then allowed herself the luxury of preparation time. She washed her hair with lavender-scented soap, letting it dry in the autumn sunshine before arranging it in a more elaborate style than her usual practical knot. As she dressed, Hannah caught her reflection in the full-length mirror. A woman, now transformed not just by the elegant gown, but by something in her eyes. A quiet confidence that hadn't been there when she first arrived in Montana Territory. "My goodness!" exclaimed Miss Grant when Hannah descended to the parlor where the boarding house residents had gathered. "You look magnificent." "The dressmaker finally makes something for herself," Mrs. Thornton observed with approval. And not a moment too soon. They walked together to the town hall, where lanterns illuminated the transformed interior. Maple boughs and chrysanthemums decorated every surface, and a small orchestra from the neighboring town tuned their instruments on a raised platform. Hannah felt eyes following her as she entered, curious glances from those who knew her only. As the new dressmaker, appreciative looks from men who had previously paid her little attention. She greeted her customers, accepting compliments on their gowns with genuine pleasure. It was nearly an hour before she spotted Matthew Harrigan across the crowded room. He stood conversing with Mayor Richardson, tall and distinguished in a well-tailored suit, his spectacles catching the lantern light. Hannah's heart performed an undignified flutter when he glanced up and saw her, a smile spreading across his face. He excused himself from the mayor and made his way toward her, navigating through dancing couples with purpose. "Miss Willowbrook," he said, his voice warm with pleasure. "You look remarkable." Hannah felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you. I'm glad you could attend." "I've been looking forward to it," Matthew admitted. "More than usual this year." The orchestra began a waltz, and Matthew extended his hand. "Would you honor me with this dance?" Hannah hesitated briefly. "I should warn you, Mr. Harrigan, I'm not particularly graceful." "Then we're well matched," he replied with a self-deprecating smile. "I've been told I have 2 left feet." His admission eased Hannah's anxiety. She placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor. His hand at her waist was respectful, his steps careful but confident. They moved together with surprising ease, finding a rhythm that accommodated both their limitations. "I brought your velvet," Matthew said as they circled the floor. "It arrived earlier than expected. Did it indeed? Hannah couldn't help smiling. And you carried it all this way yourself? I entrusted it to no one else, he confirmed, his eyes twinkling. It's in my wagon, along with something else I thought might interest you. When the dance ended, Matthew led Hannah to a quiet corner where refreshments were being served. I have a confession to make, he said, offering her a cup of punch. My monthly delivery to Pine Hollow isn't scheduled until next week. Hannah's eyebrows rose. You came early. I had compelling reasons. His gaze held hers steadily. One being a first edition of Tennyson's poems I thought you might enjoy. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Hannah deeply. You remembered our conversation about books. I remember everything about our conversation. Matthew's voice lowered slightly. It's not often I meet someone who shares my interests, especially someone as, he paused, searching for the right word, captivating as you. Before Hannah could respond, they were interrupted by Mayor Richardson, who insisted on introducing Matthew to several prominent citizens. Reluctantly, Matthew excused himself, promising to return soon. As the evening progressed, Hannah found herself circulating among various groups, accepting compliments on her workmanship from women wearing her creations. Yet her awareness remained fixed on Matthew, tracking his movements around the room even as she participated in conversations. He kept his promise, returning to her side whenever possible. They danced twice more, shared refreshments, and discussed everything from literature to the changing seasons. Each interaction deepened Hannah's impression of Matthew as a man of substance, intelligent, kind, with a quiet humor that matched her own. Might I escort you home? He asked as the festivities began to wind down near midnight. I'd welcome the chance to continue our conversation. Hannah nodded, retrieving her shawl. They walked slowly through Pine Hollow's quiet streets, their breath visible in the cool night air. Matthew offered his arm, and Hannah took it, appreciating both the warmth and the steadying presence. Tell me about Massachusetts, Matthew requested. What made you leave? The innocent question touched on territory Hannah had carefully avoided in all her Pine Hollow conversations. Yet something about Matthew's genuine interest made her consider a more honest answer than she'd given others. I came west to marry, she admitted, watching his expression carefully. A cattle rancher who advertised for a bride. Matthew's step faltered slightly. I see. And is he? The arrangement didn't work out, Hannah said simply. We had different expectations. Understanding dawned in Matthew's eyes, followed by something that looked remarkably like anger. He rejected you based on appearance. Hannah's silence was answer enough. Matthew stopped walking, turning to face her directly. Then he's a fool, Miss Willowbrook. The vehemence in his voice startled her. You hardly know me, Mr. Harrigan. I know enough. His expression softened. I know you're intelligent, skilled with your hands, appreciative of beauty in words and fabrics alike. I know you listen when others speak, that you've earned the respect of this community in mere weeks, that you rebuild your life rather than retreating when faced with disappointment. His assessment left Hannah momentarily speechless. He had seen more in her during their brief acquaintance than Jackson Montgomery had discerned in months of correspondence. They had reached the boarding house gate. Matthew released her arm reluctantly, turning to face her in the moonlight. I'm returning to Silver Creek tomorrow, but I'd like to write to you if I may. I'd like that, Hannah replied, surprised by her own certainty. And perhaps when I return next month you might show me your workshop. I've been considering expanding my fabric section and would value your professional opinion. The transparent excuse made them both smile. I would be happy to advise you, Hannah said. Professional courtesy, of course. Of course. Matthew's eyes held hers for a long moment. Good night, Miss Willowbrook. Thank you for making this evening memorable. As Hannah prepared for bed that night, she found herself comparing this evening's parting to her last interaction with Jackson Montgomery. Jackson had seen her body and found it wanting. Matthew had seen her soul and found it fascinating. The realization settled in her chest like a warm ember. For the first time since arriving in Montana Territory, Hannah felt truly seen, not as a mail-order bride, not as a seamstress, not as a body to be judged, but as a complete human being with value beyond measure. She fell asleep with Matthew's words echoing in her mind. "Then he's a fool, Miss Willowbrook." Perhaps he was right. Perhaps Jackson Montgomery's rejection had been not a reflection of her worth, but of his own limitations. And perhaps, just perhaps, that rejection had led her exactly where she needed to be. The days following the harvest dance settled into a rhythm of work and anticipation for Hannah. Business at her dressmaking shop flourished, with new customers arriving daily, many having seen her creations at the dance. The sunroom workshop now featured a waiting list posted discreetly by the door, with appointments scheduled 3 weeks in advance. Yet amid this professional success, it was the arrival of the post-rider each Wednesday that quickened Hannah's pulse. Matthew had kept his promise to write, his letters arriving with clockwork regularity, thoughtful missives filled with observations about books they'd both read, news from Silver Creek, and questions about her life and thoughts. In turn, Hannah found herself revealing more in her replies than she'd intended. Her childhood in Massachusetts, her years caring for her ailing mother, her dreams of someday having her own dress shop. She wrote of small triumphs in her work, funny encounters with customers, and the changing beauty of the Montana landscape as winter approached. What she didn't write about was Jackson Montgomery, or the real reason she'd come west. That wound, though healing, remained too tender to expose fully. "Another letter from Silver Creek?" Mrs. Thornton inquired one Wednesday afternoon, finding Hannah at her desk, pen in hand. Hannah looked up, unable to hide her smile. "Mr. Harrigan has sent me a copy of Mr. Dickens' latest novel. He thought I might enjoy it during the long winter evenings." Mrs. Thornton's expression remained neutral, but her eyes held a knowing gleam. Very thoughtful of him. One might almost suspect ulterior motives in such generosity. "It's merely a shared interest in literature," Hannah protested, though her flushed cheeks suggested otherwise. "Of course," Mrs. Thornton agreed, her tone dry. "Just as his monthly deliveries to Pine Hollow have mysteriously increased to twice monthly since the harvest dance." Hannah couldn't deny this observation. Matthew had indeed found reasons to visit Pine Hollow more frequently, each time stopping at the sunroom workshop with fabric samples to discuss or books to exchange. Their conversations had grown deeper, more personal, though always maintaining propriety under Mrs. Thornton's watchful eye. As November deepened toward December, Pine Hollow prepared for winter. Firewood was stacked beside doorways, preserves were sealed in mason jars, and winter clothes were retrieved from storage trunks. Hannah found herself busier than ever, with commissions for warm cloaks and dresses, working late into the night by lamplight. It was during one such evening, snowflakes drifting past the workshop windows, that an unexpected knock sounded at the garden door. Hannah glanced up, surprised to have a visitor so late, nearly 8 o'clock, well past her posted business hours. She opened the door to find Matthew Harrigan standing on the threshold, snow dusting his shoulders and hat. His cheeks reddened from the cold. "Matthew!" she exclaimed, momentarily forgetting formality in her surprise. "What brings you to Pine Hollow in this weather?" "Necessity," he replied, removing his hat as he stepped inside. Snow melted on the wooden floor as he unwound his scarf. "The passes will be closing soon, with the heavy snow they're predicting. I wanted to deliver outstanding orders before the roads became impassable." Hannah moved to stoke the fire, aware of Matthew's eyes following her movements. "You could have sent your assistant. Mr. Collins mentioned you have one now." "I could have," Matthew acknowledged, warming his hands by the fire. "But then I wouldn't have had the pleasure of seeing you." The directness of his statement caught Hannah off guard. They had been circling each other for weeks, their mutual interest clear but unspoken. This candid admission shifted something between them. "I've brought something for you," Matthew continued, reaching into his coat. He withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. "An early Christmas gift, if you'll accept it." Hannah took the package, their fingers brushing momentarily. "You've already been too generous with books and fabrics. This is different." Matthew's voice had softened. "Open it." Inside the wrapping, Hannah found a small velvet box. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, revealing a silver thimble nestled on dark blue velvet. The thimble was beautifully crafted, engraved with delicate flowers and vines. "It was my mother's," Matthew explained. "She always said a true dressmaker deserves a thimble that's as beautiful as the creation she brings to life." The personal nature of the gift, this piece of his family history, left Hannah momentarily speechless. "Matthew, I can't possibly—" "You can," he interrupted gently. "My mother would have liked you, Hannah. She valued people who created beauty. Through hard work and talent." Hannah closed her fingers around the thimble, feeling its weight, light in her palm, but heavy with meaning. "Thank you. I'll treasure it." They stood in silence for a moment, the fire crackling beside them. Snowflakes dancing past the windows. The workshop felt suddenly smaller, more intimate. "I should go," Matthew said finally. "The snow's getting heavier and I've imposed on your evening." "You haven't imposed," Hannah replied quickly. Too quickly, perhaps. "I mean, would you care for some tea before you head back to town?" Matthew's smile reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. "I'd like that very much." While Hannah prepared tea, Matthew browsed her bookshelf, commenting on titles they'd discussed in their letters. The domesticity of the moment struck Hannah forcefully. How natural it felt to have him in her space, how easily they moved around each other. "I've been thinking about your letters," Matthew said as they settled with their tea. "There's something I've wanted to ask, but it seemed too personal for correspondence." Hannah's pulse quickened. "Yes? You mentioned coming west to marry, but the arrangement fell through." His eyes held hers steadily. "What happened, Hannah? Truly?" The question hung between them, unavoidable now. Hannah set down her teacup, gathering courage. Perhaps it was time to lance this wound completely, to let it heal in the open air. "His name was Jackson Montgomery," she began, voice soft but steady. "A cattle rancher who advertised for a bride in the Boston Herald. We exchanged letters for months. He wrote about wanting a partnership based on mutual respect, about appearance being secondary to character." Matthew listened intently as Hannah recounted her journey west, her arrival in Silver Creek, the wait at Widow Carson's, and finally, her journey to Elk Ridge Ranch. Her voice faltered only slightly as she described Jackson's cold assessment, his thinly veiled disappointment in her appearance. "He said he needed someone who could keep up with ranch life," Hannah concluded, her fingers tracing patterns on the teacup. "But his eyes said everything his words didn't, that I wasn't the delicate, slender bride he'd envisioned." Matthew's expression had darkened progressively throughout her story. When she finished, he set his cup down with such controlled precision that Hannah sensed the anger he was containing. "He judged your capacity for hard work based on your appearance?" The question was rhetorical, his disbelief evident. "The fool didn't bother to learn that you've worked tirelessly since you were 16, that you single-handedly cared for your mother while maintaining a career." "To be fair," Hannah said, surprised by her own capacity to be generous toward Jackson now, "he wasn't looking for a seamstress. He wanted someone who could handle physical ranch work, bear children. And you couldn't do those things because you're not delicate?" Matthew shook his head. "If anything, your build suggests strength, endurance, qualities any sensible rancher would value." His defense warmed Hannah more than the tea or fire ever could. "It doesn't matter now," she said quietly. "If he hadn't." Rejected me, I wouldn't have found my way to Pine Hollow. I wouldn't have built this business. I wouldn't have—" She hesitated, suddenly aware of how revealing her next words might be. "You wouldn't have what?" Matthew prompted gently. Hannah met his gaze directly. "I wouldn't have met you." The simple truth hung in the air between them, neither a declaration nor a question, but an acknowledgement of the connection that had grown between them over these autumn months. Matthew reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "Then perhaps I owe Jackson Montgomery my gratitude, though he doesn't deserve it." Outside, the snow fell more heavily, blanketing Pine Hollow in white silence. Inside the workshop, warmed by firelight and something more profound, Hannah felt the last fragments of her old wound finally heal. "I should go before the roads become impassable," Matthew said reluctantly, though he made no move to withdraw. His hand. "Yes," Hannah agreed, equally reluctant. "Mrs. Thornton would have strong words about propriety if you stayed much longer." As they stood at the garden door minutes later, Matthew turned to her once more. "Hannah, I came to Pine Hollow tonight with more purpose than just deliveries or Christmas gifts." Her heart quickened. "Oh?" "I wanted to ask if I might court you properly." His directness was tempered by the vulnerability in his eyes. "I've grown to care for you deeply these past months. Your intelligence, your resilience, your kindness. Everything about you compels me." The confession, so different from Jackson's cold assessment, brought tears to Hannah's eyes. "I would like that very much," she whispered. Matthew's smile illuminated his entire face. "Then I'll call on you properly when I return after Christmas, with Mrs. Thornton's permission, of course." As Hannah watched him disappear into the swirling snow, the silver thimble warm in her pocket, she felt transformed by his words. Not just by his wish to court her, but by the way he had seen and valued all the parts of herself she had once believed insufficient. Winter descended on Pine Hollow with a vengeance, transforming the valley into a landscape of pristine white broken, only by plumes of smoke rising from chimneys. Deep snow closed the mountain passes, isolating the town from larger settlements like Silver Creek. For 6 weeks, no mail riders ventured through, no supply wagons arrived, and certainly no visitors braved the treacherous conditions. For Hannah, this isolation brought both challenge and opportunity. With fabric supplies dwindling, she turned to creative solutions, repurposing garments brought by townspeople, incorporating unexpected materials, and teaching mending techniques to women eager to extend the life of their winter wardrobes. "You've become quite the community fixture," Mrs. Thornton observed one evening as they sat before the fire, Hannah demonstrating a darning technique to Miss Porter. "Half the town seems to find its way to the sunroom these days, whether they need sewing done or not." It was true. Hannah's workshop had evolved into something of a gathering place during the long winter days. Women brought their mending and stayed for tea and conversation. Children came for lessons in basic stitches, paying with stories and songs rather than coins. Even a few men appeared with torn work clothes, lingering longer than strictly necessary to hear Hannah read aloud from her growing collection of books. Yet despite this social flourishing, Hannah found herself watching the mountain passes, counting days until they might be clear enough for travelers. Her last letter from Matthew, delivered just before the heavy snows, had promised to visit the moment the roads permit passage. She reread it often, his confident handwriting bringing his voice to mind during the long, quiet evenings. February arrived with a gradual warming trend. Icicles dripping from eaves, snow receded from sunlit patches of ground, and the distant sound of the creek breaking free from ice drifted through town. When the first mail rider finally appeared, his horse exhausted from navigating the muddy mountain trails, Hannah was among those who gathered eagerly outside the post office. "2 letters for you, Miss Willowbrook," announced Mr. Fleming, the postmaster, handing over envelopes with a knowing smile. Both from Silver Creek, it appears. Hannah recognized Matthew's handwriting immediately on the first letter. The second, however, gave her pause. The paper was finer, the script unfamiliar and feminine. She tucked both into her pocket, waiting until she returned to the privacy of her workshop to read them. Matthew's letter contained the news she'd hoped for. He planned to travel to Pine Hollow within the week, weather permitting, bringing much-needed supplies, and he wrote, matters of personal importance to discuss. Her heart quickened at the barely concealed meaning behind his formal phrasing. The second letter, when opened, proved more surprising. Dear Miss Willowbrook, you will not know me, but I am Grace Montgomery, sister to Jackson Montgomery of Elk Ridge Ranch. News travels slowly in winter, but word of your establishment in Pine Hollow eventually reached us. I write with a dual purpose. First, to extend my sincere apologies for my brother's unconscionable behavior. Jackson has always been governed more by appearance than substance, a flaw our late mother unfortunately encouraged. Second, I find myself in need of a skilled dressmaker for my upcoming wedding. My fiancé, Dr. Thomas Reed, and I will be traveling through Pine Hollow on our way to Silver Creek next month. Might I impose upon you for a consultation? With deepest respect, Grace Montgomery. Hannah read the letter twice, emotions swirling. Grace Montgomery, Jackson's sister. The connection she'd tried so hard to leave behind had found her anyway, though in an unexpected form. After reflection, Hannah penned a polite response, agreeing to the consultation without reference to Grace's apology or the history with her brother. The past was done. She would not refuse business based on family connections. True to his word, Matthew arrived in Pine Hollow 3 days later. Hannah spotted his wagon from the sunroom window, her heart leaping at the sight of his tall figure handling the reins. He looked up as if sensing her gaze, tipping his hat with a smile that warmed her despite the February chill. Their reunion, though observed by curious eyes throughout town, was everything Hannah had hoped for during the long winter separation. Matthew called formally at the boarding house that evening, presenting Mrs. Thornton with a jar of honey from his own beehives before requesting permission to escort Hannah to Sunday services. I believe that would be acceptable, Mrs. Thornton replied, her usual severity softened by evident approval. Miss Willowbrook has conducted herself with perfect propriety during her residence here. The following days established a pattern. Matthew attended to his business dealings during the day, while Hannah worked in her shop. Evenings found them together in the boarding house parlor or, when weather permitted, walking slowly through town, their conversations picking up threads from their letters as if no time had passed at all. I've missed this, Matthew confessed during one such walk, Hannah's hand tucked into the crook of his arm. Letters are poor substitutes for seeing your expressions when we discuss Mr. Dickens' latest chapter. Though they served their purpose, Hannah replied, smiling up at him, I've learned more about your thoughts through writing than I might have in casual conversation. True enough. Matthew guided her around a puddle, his touch gentle but secure. Some truths are easier to commit to paper than to speak aloud. The meaningful glance accompanying these words hinted at depths still unexplored between them, feelings expressed in the careful phrasing of letters but not yet spoken directly. Sunday arrived bright and clear, the church bells ringing across Pine Hollow with particular resonance. Hannah dressed with special care in a new dress of cornflower blue, designed to complement her eyes and crafted during the long winter evenings. As she pinned her hair, she caught herself humming, a habit she'd thought lost after her mother's death. Matthew arrived promptly at 10 o'clock, hat in hand, his own attire freshly pressed. You look beautiful, he said simply, his admiration evident in his gaze. They walked to church together, joining the flow of townspeople along the muddy streets. Hannah was acutely aware of glances and whispers, though these held none of the judgment she'd feared in Silver Creek. Instead, she sensed approval, even affection, in the nods and smiles directed their way. Pine Hollow's small church filled quickly, the congregation larger than usual as cabin-fevered residents emerged from winter isolation. Hannah and Matthew found seats beside Mrs. Thornton and the other boarding house residents, who made room with knowing smiles. Reverend Collins had just begun the first hymn when a late arrival caused heads to turn toward the door. A tall man in an expensive coat entered, followed by a petite woman in a traveling ensemble that spoke of considerable wealth. The couple hesitated at finding the church so full, scanning for available seats. Hannah's breath caught as recognition dawned. The man was unfamiliar, but the woman, with her delicate features and Montgomery's distinctive blue eyes, could only be Grace, which meant they had arrived in Pine Hollow weeks earlier than her letter had indicated. Before Hannah could process this unexpected development, Matthew rose to his feet. "Dr. Reed," he called quietly, gesturing to the empty space beside them. "There's room here." The couple made their way down the aisle, Grace's curious gaze finding Hannah's face. A flicker of recognition crossed her features, followed by something like relief. "Thank you," Dr. Reed murmured as they settled into the pew. The journey from Silver Creek was more challenging than anticipated. Throughout the service, Hannah felt Grace's occasional glances. She focused on Reverend Collins's sermon about new beginnings and second chances, drawing strength from Matthew's steady presence beside her. As the congregation rose for the final hymn, Matthew's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with her own in a gesture visible to everyone around them, the public declaration of his regard warmed Hannah's cheeks but steadied her heart. When the service concluded, there was no avoiding introductions. Dr. Reed stepped forward first, his manner cordial. "Thomas Reed, Miss Willowbrook. I understand you're the talented dressmaker my fiancé has been corresponding with." "Hannah Willowbrook," she replied, accepting his handshake. "Yes, though I wasn't expecting Miss Montgomery until next month." Grace stepped forward, her resemblance to Jackson even more pronounced up close. "We had to adjust our plans," she explained, her voice soft but direct. "My brother is accompanying us to Bozeman for business, and we thought it prudent to—" She hesitated, glancing at Matthew. "To avoid unnecessary encounters," Matthew finished, his tone making it clear he understood exactly who Grace's brother was. A silent communication passed between Grace and Hannah, an acknowledgement of shared knowledge of a connection neither had sought but both now faced. "Perhaps you might call at my workshop tomorrow," Hannah suggested, professional courtesy overriding personal discomfort, "for the consultation you mentioned." "I would appreciate that," Grace replied, genuine warmth entering her expression. "And perhaps we might speak of other matters as well." As the church emptied around them, Hannah became aware of curious glances from Pine Hollow residents, not directed at her and Matthew this time, but at the four of them standing together, an unexpected tableau of connections and history. Yet, for the first time since arriving in Montana territory, Hannah felt no need to hide any part of her story. Let them wonder, let them whisper. She stood straight back beside Matthew, her hand still in his, publicly acknowledged and privately cherished for exactly who she was. Spring arrived in Pine Hollow with a riot of wildflowers carpeting the valley and birdsong filling the dawn air. The transformation of the landscape mirrored the changes in Hannah's life, gradual at first, then suddenly vibrant and undeniable. Grace Montgomery's visit to the sunroom workshop the day after church had proven unexpectedly cathartic. Away from curious eyes, the two women had spoken frankly about Jackson, about expectations and disappointments, about the strange twists of fate that connected their lives. "I knew what you looked like," Grace had confessed as Hannah measured her for her wedding gown. "Jackson received your daguerreotype. He showed it to me before you arrived." Hannah's hands had stilled momentarily. "And what did you think?" "I thought you looked kind," Grace replied simply, "and that my brother was making a terrible mistake in his shallow assessment." The honesty in Grace's voice had eased something in Hannah's heart. By the time they'd finished discussing silk versus satin for the wedding ensemble, an unexpected friendship had begun to form between these two women, connected by one man's rejection. Now, as April sunshine streamed through the newly cleaned workshop, Hannah put the finishing touches on Grace's wedding gown. The creation was her finest work yet, ivory silk with delicate beading at the bodice, designed to complement Grace's petite frame while allowing freedom of movement for the journey to their new home in California after the wedding. "It's magnificent," breathed Mrs. Winston, who had stopped by to deliver a basket of early spring herbs. "Dr. Reed won't be able to take his eyes off her." "That's the intention," Hannah replied with a smile, carefully packing the gown for transport to Silver Creek, where the wedding would take place in 2 days. The bell above the garden door chimed, announcing Matthew's arrival. Since February, he had extended his Pine Hollow visits, staying at the hotel rather than making the journey back to Silver Creek each night. Today, he would escort Hannah to Silver Creek for the wedding, her first return to the town since that fateful day 6 months ago. "Ready for tomorrow's journey?" he asked, kissing her cheek in greeting, a liberty Mrs. Thornton now permitted given their publicly acknowledged courtship. "Almost." Hannah gestured toward the packed wedding ensemble. "Just need to secure this for transport." Matthew watched her work, his expression thoughtful. "Are you comfortable attending this wedding? It will mean seeing Jackson again." Hannah considered the question as she tied the protective wrapping. 6 months ago, the prospect would have filled her with dread. Now, it barely caused a ripple in her contentment. "I am," she said honestly. "Grace has become a friend, and I'm proud of my work on her gown. As for Jackson," she shrugged lightly, "he's simply someone I used to know." Matthew's smile warmed his entire face. "You're remarkable, Hannah Willowbrook." "Hardly remarkable," she protested. "Just healing." "Both, I think." Matthew stepped closer, taking her hand. "Which brings me to something I've been wanting to discuss with you." Hannah's heart quickened at his serious tone. "Yes, I've purchased the building next to the Mercantile in Silver Creek," he began, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "It was originally a millinery shop, but has stood empty since Mrs. Whitaker passed away last year. It has excellent light. Display windows, living quarters upstairs." "Matthew," Hannah interrupted gently, "are you asking me to open a dress shop in Silver Creek?" "I'm asking much more than that." His voice deepened with emotion. "I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife, joining our businesses as we join our lives. The Mercantile and a dress shop, side by side, run by a husband and wife who respect each other's talents and cherish each other's hearts." Though they had been courting openly for months, the actual proposal took Hannah's breath away. Not because it was unexpected, but because of the thoughtfulness behind it. Matthew hadn't just proposed marriage, but a partnership that honored her independence and ambition. "We could divide our time between Silver Creek and Pine Hollow," he continued, when she didn't immediately respond. "Perhaps eventually find an apprentice to manage this location while we—" Hannah stopped his words with a finger to his lips. "Yes," she said simply, "to all of it." The journey to Silver Creek the following day was filled with plans and possibilities. Hannah found herself viewing the landscape differently now, not as a foreign territory that had rejected her, but as the place where she would build a future alongside the man who had truly seen her. They arrived as afternoon shadows lengthened, the town bustling with pre-wedding activity. Hannah felt curious glances as Matthew helped her down from the wagon outside the hotel, but these held none of the power they might have had months ago. "Miss Willowbrook." Grace emerged from the hotel, her face lighting with genuine pleasure. "You've arrived just in time. I was beginning to worry." "The gown is safe," Hannah assured her, indicating the carefully packed bundle. "We can do a final fitting this evening." Grace insisted on walking with them to the hotel, chattering about wedding details and introducing Hannah to passers-by as "my gifted dressmaker and friend from Pine Hollow." It was during one such introduction outside the Silver Creek Cafe that Hannah felt a familiar gaze. Jackson Montgomery stood frozen on the boardwalk, his expression unreadable as he took in the sight of his former would-be bride, his sister, and Matthew Harrigan conversing animatedly. Hannah met his eyes steadily, neither seeking confrontation nor avoiding it. She felt Matthew's hand settle protectively at the small of her back, but sensed no tension in his posture, only support. After a moment's hesitation, Jackson approached, hat in hand. "Miss Willowbrook," he said, his greeting stiff but polite. "Grace mentioned you would be attending the wedding." "Mr. Montgomery?" Hannah replied evenly. "Yes, I designed your sister's gown." An awkward silence stretched between them until Grace stepped in. "Hannah has established quite a successful dressmaking business in Pine Hollow. She'll be opening a second location here in Silver Creek soon, adjoining Mr. Harrigan's Mercantile." Jackson's gaze shifted between Hannah and Matthew, comprehension dawning. "I see. That's very enterprising." "We think so," Matthew replied, his arm slipping around Hannah's waist in a gesture that left no doubt about their relationship. Brief encounter concluded with polite nods, Jackson continuing on his way with the air of a man who had glimpsed a road not taken. Hannah watched him go, feeling neither triumph nor resentment, only a gentle acknowledgement that their paths had crossed for a purpose neither could have foreseen. The wedding itself, held in Silver Creek's small church 2 days later, proved a joyous affair. Hannah watched with pride as Grace floated down the aisle in the gown she had created, Dr. Reed's face illuminating with love at the sight of his bride. Throughout the ceremony, Matthew's hand remained clasped with Hannah's, his occasional glances conveying a promise of their own future celebration. When the minister spoke of two becoming one while maintaining their individual strengths, Hannah felt the words resonate through her very being. At the reception held in the hotel dining room, Hannah found herself surrounded by Silver Creek residents, curious about her dress shop, many placing orders for summer garments. Word had spread about her skill, and the community that had once witnessed her humiliation now sought her talents. "You've conquered Silver Creek," Matthew murmured, as they shared a rare, quiet moment on the hotel veranda, watching stars emerge above the mountains. Hannah shook her head, leaning against his shoulder. "Not conquered, simply found my place within it on my own terms. Our terms now," he corrected gently, kissing her temple. As guests began departing, Grace sought Hannah out, pulling her into a warm embrace. "Thank you," she whispered, "not just for the perfect gown, but for showing me what grace truly looks like." Hannah returned the embrace, this final piece of her healing journey falling into place. "Be happy," she said simply. Later that night, walking back to the hotel through Silver Creek's quiet streets, Hannah and Matthew paused at the empty building beside the Mercantile, their future joint enterprise. Moonlight silvered the display windows, transforming the vacant space into a canvas of possibility. "What will you call your shop?" Matthew asked, his arms secure around her waist. Hannah considered the question, remembering the journey that had brought her here. From rejection to resilience, from humiliation to happiness, from hiding herself to embracing every inch of who she was. "New beginnings," she said finally, the name feeling right on her lips, "because that's what I found here, against all expectations." Matthew's kiss in the moonlight sealed this promise, not of perfection or fairy tale endings, but of something far more valuable, a love built on seeing and cherishing each other's true selves, flaws, and strengths alike. 6 months later, when Hannah walked down the aisle of Silver Creek's church in a gown of her own design that celebrated rather than disguised her curves. She carried wildflowers from the meadow where she'd once lost her way. The symmetry wasn't lost on her. How a journey begun in rejection had led to this day of complete acceptance. Matthew waited at the altar, his eyes never leaving hers as she approached, his smile containing all the words they'd exchanged through letters, conversations, and silent understanding. When he took her hands in his, whispering, "You are the most beautiful woman I have ever known," Hannah knew he saw not just her appearance, but her resilience, her creativity, her whole self. And, in that moment of perfect recognition, the last whisper of doubt dissolved like morning mist in sunlight. She had finally found the place and the person who saw her exactly as she was and loved her not despite it, but because of it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.